So we ended up the last video looking at some of the hypha and the cells and the structures that we can see when we're looking at members of the fungus kingdom. And there is a really kind of interesting example of what's known as a dimorphic fungus, which literally di is two and morph, think face. So this name literally translates as a two-faced fungus. And these are pathogens. These are fungi that cause diseases there. And what's really interesting is they can actually shift between the yeast-like cells that are out there, those spherical kinds of cells, or they can grow in these long filamentous forms that are mold-like depending on the temperature. So they will grow in a mold-like form at room temperature, and when they enter your body temperature, that's where they're going to shift from these long, thin, thread-like hypha to the yeast-like form. And the thought is the yeast-like form is better able to travel throughout your vasculature. So they can travel through your arteries and get into arterioles and capillary beds easier because they are these little spherical cells as opposed to these long, thin threads that would get trapped. And so when you get a fungal infection, remember one of the primary ways that fungi eat is they are decomposers. So a fungal infection, you are literally getting a decomposer that can spread throughout your body, and these little yeast-like cells will be digesting your tissues and your organs throughout your body. So a fungal infection is not something to joke around when we're looking at this. The other feature that we want to look at that is used to classify a lot of these organisms is reproduction. It's biology, and that's one of the primary features of biological organisms is this ability to reproduce themselves. And we can see in the center of this, we've got our mycelium. So remember that tangled mass of hyphae that is going to make up the body of the fungus right here. And these fungi that are out there can go through an asexual reproduction cycle, or they can go through this cycle over here where they're doing sexual reproduction. So they can actually do both forms of reproduction, either using mitosis or they can use a combination of mitosis and meiosis on this side. And when we look at the asexual reproduction, this could be something like the budding that we saw before with the yeast cells, and also you can have those long hyphae strands can fragment, and that will release some new cells out there. And so those cells can basically germinate or grow up to produce a new mycelium. And when we look at this process of asexual reproduction, where we do see specific structures with spores on them, they are very distinct. And here we can see some examples of the structures under the microscope. And this one, you've got a hyphae that grows up and it makes a bunch of free spores on the end. And these spores are the product of mitosis. So it's asexual spores. And this is a characteristic structure that we see with certain fungi that are out there, or certain molds that are out there, will make what are known as conidiospores that are on the end of a hyphae that is termed a conidiophore. And then you've got these little conidiospores on the end there. If you make a structure known as a sporangiophore, on the end of this, you've got a little sac that is known as a sporangium, and so your spores are inside of there. So conidiospores are free, whereas the sporangiospores are in a sac on the end of that hypha. And sometimes within the hyphal strand itself, you will actually see a thickening of the cell wall, and that makes what's known as a chlamydospore. So all three of those, when we're looking at it, those can be asexual spore structures. When you're looking at yeast, they're going to just make more like a chlamydospore, but it's a single cell, so there really isn't an equivalent for that. When we look over here on this side, with sexual reproduction, this involves those cells growing up and fusing together. And like I mentioned before in the first video, the interesting thing about these guys over here in the fungus kingdom is these are actually haploid cells. So when you're looking at a yeast cell, it is existing as a haploid cell, and it's doing mitosis as a haploid cell. And the same thing with molds that are out there. They are going through life as haploid cells doing this asexual reproduction. And when they run into another one, so imagine two hyphae that are growing and they run into each other, that's where you're going to have this process of sexual reproduction occurring. In the first step, they're going to do what's known as plasmogamy. And so think plasma is fluid and gamy, that's like a union or a joining. And so here it is literally, the term means the joining of the cytoplasm for the two cells. And so they're going to fuse together and make what's known as a dikaryon, which is basically a cell with two nuclei inside of it. So remember, a haploid cell has now got two copies of the chromosomes, and then the two nuclei fuse together. So karyo, remember this is a kernel, and gamy is the union. So literally, nuclei unite, and that is going to give us our diploid cells that are out there. So this is what we're used to thinking about for ourselves and plants, that they are diploid organisms. But the only time a fungus is going through the diploid stage is during sexual reproduction here. The diploid cell can undergo that reductive cell division with meiosis and produce those haploid cells again. And just like what we saw before, the haploid cells produced as a result of this are going to make some very distinct structures. Those cells, or the spores, can get released. They float around, they land somewhere in a favorable environment with food and water, and those things are going to germinate, and the hyphae are going to grow or elongate at the tip, and that will produce a new mycelium over here. And so when we look at this, very distinct processes, asexual or sexual reproduction. And remember, as a result of sexual reproduction, you make kids that are genetically different. So even a mold can have sex and make kids that are a little different from itself. Some of those kids might get traits that allow them to survive better in that environment than the parents did. And those are the ones that are going to come to dominate that environment. And that's that whole theory of evolution by means of natural selection going on. When we look at the spore structures that can be produced as a result of sexual reproduction, they are very different from what we saw with our asexual ones. And this was used to classify the fungi that were out there based on this spore structure. And over here you can see these little spores are inside of a sac, or what's known as an ascus. And so those fungi were classified in this division known as Ascomycota. And remember, when we looked at our hierarchy, division was not on there. This is a different kind of taxonomic scheme from what Linnaeus was using. So if you reproduced and made your spores inside of a sac like this yeast cell right here, you would be classified in this division Ascomycota. If you made this weird little structure here that is a club with these 4 cells on the end, think meiosis produces 4 cells, then you would be classified in this division Basidiomycota, and you made basidiospores on the end of this. And we'll see this in lab, but when you're eating a mushroom, the gills underneath the cap on the mushroom, those are where these little spores. So effectively, when you're eating a mushroom, you are eating millions of little baby mushrooms that are hanging off of those gills there. This one's kind of an interesting one. It's classified in the division Zygomycota, and here you can actually see the 2 hyphae that have fused together, and right here is something that is known as a zygosporangium. So it's inside of a sac, and they said this looked kind of like an egg sac there, so you made zygospores. And there was this other kind of interesting little group over here that is known as the Microsporidia, and you can see these little dots inside of this piece of tissue right here. And if you're a Microsporidia, you're different from these other guys that are over here. You are an obligate intracellular parasite, and you lack things like mitochondria, peroxisomes, and centrioles. And what these guys do that's really interesting when you look at the Microsporidia is the spores actually release a little tube that's known as a polar tubule that will allow them to actually pierce these membranes on the host tissues right there, and it allows those Microsporidia to actually get inside of the host cells there. So like I said, these guys are intracellular parasites. They are actually active inside of the cells that are out there. So very distinctly different from these other divisions that we see where we're looking at the sexual spore structures. If you look in the book, you can see some of these different groups are elucidated there along with some life cycles. And I'm not concerned about the individual details of this, but if you look at that figure that I made before, this is what I showed without all the extra details. There is your asexual reproduction for this particular mold that is shown in this figure right here. They're going through this process of mitosis, and they can make these spores that can germinate. And here we can see the sexual reproduction with the fusion of these two hyphae together that are going ahead and making that zygospore right there through that process of plasmogamy and karyogamy, and then you go through meiosis. And this particular version of it, what happens is the spores produced from meiosis, the haploid cells that come out, are going to undergo mitosis. So you'll have 4 kids, and then they will clone themselves over and over, and you can get hundreds of them, and that's where we get the little spores that are going to appear in a little sporangium here. So some interesting kinds of differences when we look at reproduction for members of the fungus kingdom. And again, look at the characteristics of members of the fungus kingdom and look at their reproductive cycles. That's what I want people to focus on.